Take a network break. Help yourself to a virtual donut as we chew on this week's tech news. We're going to discuss a Nokia acquisition, new features in VMware Cloud Foundation, space networking, and more. A sad note today is Greg's final network break before he sails off into retirement, or maybe a happy note for Greg. But I'm joined by Johna Johnson of Nemerites and Ethan Banks of the Packet Pushers, not only for their astute analysis, but also for their emotional support for this episode.
Emotional support, yes. Greg's final network break. This was... Greg, what was this? The third show we started, I believe. We had so. The main show was Priority Queue, and then the network break launched.
That's right. We had heavy networking, or as it was just called back in the day, Packet Pushers, and then it became Priority Queue because we had too many shows, and that's where the joke "too much networking was never enough" sort of started out, or was extended into something more than just a bloviated, from some influencer somewhere. And then we started this one because it was like newsy. It was meant to be sort of a news thing, wasn't it?
Yep. And it's become one of the most popular shows on the network. It's usually tied with heavy networking for number of downloads and listens and subscribers and all of that stuff. So it's a really important show in our lineup. And I think with you retiring, if anyone's wondering if it's going to continue, yes, of course, Network Break is going to continue. We got plans way into the future for Network Break, it being a really key show for what we do here. And of course, Johna is going to be joining Drew with the weekly analysis and so on.
Yeah, and this being positioned sort of as Greg replacement is more than a little scary. I think anyone that's listened to the Heavy Strategy Packet Pushers show knows that my actual role is not Greg, so this could be kind of fun. But yeah, Greg, I'm pretty sure that the community is going to miss you enormously, because it's not just about the news, it's not just about the analysis, but it's also about your inimitable take on things. Inimitable and sometimes unsugar-coated, maybe is the way to put it.
Unsugar-coated is the nicest way to say that, yes.
Well, there's nothing to be gained by beating around the bush, as they used to say. Well, thank you very much. So here's my call to action for people. If you're in the audience and thinking, what could you do to help Greg? The answer here is to help Packet Pushers. If you're talking to vendors or sponsors or marketing people, if you are a marketing person, and I've helped you over the years, get in and sponsor Packet Pushers. Part of my retirement plan includes Packet Pushers revenue going forward. Obviously, Ethan is now the owner of Packet Pushers, and he continues to run the business as normal with the team, Drew and Robin, and a whole expanded host of new shows and people doing podcast hosts. We've got Network Automation with Eric Chu. We've got Drew starting up a podcast around packet protectors, around cybersecurity, Data Cloud, IPv6. All those shows are there, and they all have opportunities for sponsors to reach an audience. And if you've been watching the response to my retirement notice, you might notice how many people listen to podcasts and are influenced by them. And if you're a marketing person, maybe you should want some of that. So please, if you want to help me, you could help me by keeping Packet Pushers going and getting some sponsorship in that direction. Tell vendors that it works for you. Tell the salespeople who tell their marketing people, whatever it is. And that would really help me have a retirement and save me from having to come back to work again. So you may have to run a Save Greg from... Save the audience from Greg coming back.
If you're a vendor that's listening, we have even more shows coming that you can sponsor. We got 3 new shows being planned, and lots of plans for the future. We're working with a variety of new hosts and a variety of topics. So if you haven't checked in with us for a while to understand what Packet Pushers offers from a sponsorship perspective, we have a lot going on, a lot. And I would love to catch up with you and check in on what things we have to offer these days. In a lot of ways, the train is just getting rolling.
I would be remiss in not plugging, which will also help Greg, the Heavy Strategy podcast, which he and I started. Actually, he started it, invited me in as a co-host, and that will be continuing on to the foreseeable future. If you are attempting to reach the audience of engaged architects and CTOs and folks that make strategic technology decisions, that's the show. And once again, I will be doing my best to imitate the inimitable, or at least forge a new direction in a path set by the inimitable.
Oh, you keep saying inimitable, Johna, and no one expects you to be Greg. But I will say this: you have enough contrarian viewpoints and outside of the box thinking that your opinions will be very welcome here indeed.
Absolutely.
Dude, thank you for that. And I keep saying inimitable because I'm so proud of myself just to be able to say it. It's a really hard combination of syllables.
I've always avoided such bloviation. I do have a tendency to waffle with, expanded vocabulary, but generally I've avoided it. But I'm in for it today if you want. You might make it a challenge for today's show to be, heavy on the bloviation and the extended vocab.
It's not even extended vocabulary. It's just when you put those syllables together, it's hard to do. It's hard to do pre-coffee in the morning. That's all I can say.
Yes, well done. All right, well, let's do some of the business we have to do, and then we'll get on to the news. First, we're sponsored today by Palo Alto Networks. You can discover the latest advancements in network security at Intersect 2024. This is a virtual event where industry tech and cybersecurity professionals discuss how advancements in SASE are reshaping expectations. Topics include a secure enterprise browser, using SASE to secure and accelerate applications, the role of AI and data security, and more. Intersect 2024 is available on demand now at intersect.paloaltonetworks.com. And speaking of Palo Alto Networks, they're also joining us for today's Tech Bite. The rise of SASE has a little bit eclipsed SD-WAN as organizations develop strategies and analyze products for secure access. But SD-WAN is, in fact, an essential component of SASE. And sponsor Palo Alto Networks is here to say SD-WAN is the most important component. On today's Tech Bites podcast, we talk with Palo Alto Networks about why SD-WAN underpins a SASE offering. And we'll discuss SD-WAN capabilities you should keep in mind when evaluating a secure access service edge solution. All right, to the news first. Nokia is offering $2.3 billion to acquire optics maker Infinera in a cash and stock deal. Nokia says the acquisition will help it scale its optics business, increase its in-house optical tech, and generate an estimated operating profit of 20 million euros by 2027.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting in that optical networking. It's not just optics, though, Drew. It's also a bunch of DWDM switches as well. So it's got optical line switches, packet optical, which is the edge of the network, IP to optical, but also a whole range of DWDM switches in here. And particularly at this particular point in time, coherent pluggables. That is the optical pluggables that go directly into Ethernet switches, where you have a line card and you plug in a DWDM optic, and all of a sudden your whole access to the DWDM network, or an optical network as it's now called, changes a lot, right? Mm-hmm. And Infinera owns the whole stack. They make the chips, they make the lasers, they own the technology and the IP. They're not just rebadging it from someone else. So they're not buying bits and pieces like, most of the vendors go out there and buy an ASIC from from Broadcom, and they buy a power supply from company A, they buy some metalwork from company B who, makes them on demand and all that sort of stuff. Infinera actually owns some other things. The thing that surprised me about this, Drew, is it's only a $2.3 billion purchase. But the result is that Nokia will have a 20% market share, according to one of the analyst firms. So it's kind of interesting that Infinera, which has been such a large part of this DWDM or optical networking, is actually a reasonably small value. And I think there's a lot of room to grow here around optical networking.
I mean, to spend $2 billion to get 20% market share does seem like a good trade. So yeah, I can see why Nokia would be interested in that. Particularly, I'm guessing it's already customers they're selling to, but owning that DWDM business, particularly for the hyperscalers, is probably appealing to Nokia.
And what struck me about this is not just what they're doing, but also what they're not doing. In other words, another piece of this is they're selling Alcatel submarine networks to the French government for just, $350 million. But to me, that says focus on my overall strategy, which is not operating, passive networks. It's actually, as you guys were saying, getting much deeper. Well, they're very deep already, but deeper into the optical switching space.
Yeah, I think it's good for Nokia as well, because they've got Infinera has been very popular with the megascale cloud providers, providing obviously optical and networks between data centers. Obviously, the megascale providers use huge amount of bandwidth between their locations, and they've been building out their own backbones at an enormous rate, and indeed running transoceanic cables quite a lot, submarine cables around the world. They don't want to use the internet. They don't want to do business with telcos because, as I've always said, telcos are miserable and can't run a business to save themselves. And their monopolistic position is usually what keeps them in business. So for Nokia, who wants to supply that market, they're getting themselves well positioned to get a post-telco market. The telcos are shrinking at the moment. Their spending is shrinking. But if they can now put themselves in play with the megascale cloud providers, could their Nokia Ethernet combined with the optical start to displace Arista in some of those accounts, which would be an interesting thought.
All right, moving on. Broadcom has announced new features in VMware Cloud Foundation, or VCF. It's the company's private cloud platform. New features in the 5.2 release include VCF import. This lets you integrate and merge your standalone vSphere and vSAN environments into VCF without, quote, needing a full rebuild of the customer environment. And this may be the biggest feature of the release for customers who are just on vSphere or other products and are being compelled to move to VCF. Presumably, VMware wants to make it as easy as possible. It also means things like patches and upgrades for the different components should be released at the same time instead of on different schedules for different components.
Compelled, Drew. Compelled? It's a choice. You know, there's so much value to be had here. You know what I'm you know, the other side here is that Broadcom's giving customers so many more features and capabilities inside the bundle that they're selling them. Surely.
Yes. It's a compelling proposition.
I think that the VMware process is not going as well, and certainly Broadcom's not slowing down. But what they have done here is focused all of their so-called research and development into the migration process. So if you're going to be forced to buy VVF or VCF, then you've got to get from where you were to where Broadcom wants you to be. So
yes.
If you're going to, Broadcom saying you're now going to be using NSX and it's not a choice. If you're going to be using vSAN and it's not a choice, then you've got to help people migrate from where they were into the new system. So what Broadcom's doing here is saving themselves. They're not helping customers, in my view. They're doing what they have to do to justify the increased pricing. And there's no question here that Broadcom's managed to increase the pricing by roughly 300%, as we predicted all those years ago when the acquisition was announced. But what they've done is they're basically saying you have to buy this bundle, and in this bundle is all these products that used to be optional. Mm-hmm. This is where we're at, right? And the only way that Broadcom is going to make that land and stick is if it's easier for customers to migrate from where they were to where Broadcom wants them to be. And so I would question whether this, migration facility is ready. Seems to me like it would have been rushed out, and maybe you want to be just a little bit behind the bleeding edge there before rushing into it. And maybe you want to wait a little bit longer before you commit too deeply to Broadcom. I know that a lot of people are, talking to different vendors over the last 2 weeks, having final conversations with people, and they're saying that the disruption that Broadcom's causing to customers is becoming a major talking point, and it's unclear whether how can I say this in a way that's reasonable? It is unclear whether Broadcom's long-term position is going to work out the way they want it to.
Yeah, even in our Slack channel, we see a lot of frustration with the way that Broadcom has retooled VMware and foisted a lot of things on the community that didn't necessarily want. So Broadcom does have a lot of work cut out for it to try to convince customers that what they are doing will, in the end, be for the benefit of the customer. A couple of the things that VMware is touting or Broadcom is touting in this new release is ESXi live patching. Broadcom says admins can apply critical patches to ESXi hosts without the need for maintenance windows. The Register, in its article, noted that the open source Zen hypervisor has offered live patching since 2016. So maybe a little bit of a latecomer here with this capability. Another thing they're touting is VCF Edge. This is a version of VMware Cloud Foundation that's been quote unquote optimized for edge use cases. Includes compute, storage, and networking, of course, all built on VMware platforms, for cases where companies want to collect and process data closer to where the data is being generated.
It'd be interesting to see how it works out, I suppose. Oh, I don't care anymore.
You don't need to care anymore.
That's right. You're getting paid not to care.
Yeah, my care factor is kind of dropping to zero, but I think this isn't going to run smooth. I think Broadcom managed to increasingly. I think Broadcom's previous acquisitions in the same space, the CA and the security
Symantec.
one that they,
Symantec.
Yeah. I think customers were kind of willing to say, "Oh, that's not a big deal. It was a small part of our overall budget. We can afford to, if we're just gonna, that's fine, leave it." I wonder if, because VMware is so structural inside of enterprise IT, it is in that position. Can they actually get will customers roll over and, once they've locked into the first 3 years, because they're locking into 3-year upfront deals and you've got very few choices, assuming you can get a quote, by the way, assuming you can actually get a price. But if you will, in 3 years' time, will people remember enough to say we're still got to find an alternative, or we need to shift that cost off the books or somehow? Will they remember? I don't know. It'll be an interesting one to see what the numbers look like in 3 years.
Frankly, I'm sort of backing Broadcom on their approach. I think VMware is so tightly integrated with so many folks' infrastructure that the thought of ripping it out to go for a replacement just to avoid Broadcom's onerous changes is too painful. And for the majority of large customers, Broadcom is going to prevail here. That's just my prediction.
I guess, and enterprise IT is much more used to being boiled frog. And normally the heat gets turned up gradually. This idea of dropping a bucket of cold water on top of you is not normally the way it's done. So maybe it feels, maybe it's a bit not the normal way.
Yeah. Johna, you had a comment?
Oh, no, I was just sort of chuckling along. But I guess if we're moving on to the next one, I think in lockstep with data center switching, our friends over at Dell'Oro Group are reporting that campus switch sales declined sharply in the first quarter of 2024. They dropped to a 2-year low in the first quarter by 23%, with only 2 vendors bucking the downward trend, Arista and Ubiquiti. We'll talk about that in a second. Dell'Oro rather circularly attributes Arista's good performance in part to a 3-quarter-long sustained increase in their market share, contrasting with the sharp decrease in Cisco's shipments of campus switches. Drew, what are your thoughts on this? This is sounding very familiar, especially after last week.
Right. If you listened to last week, you might be like, are they repeating a story? No, last week we covered a similar story. That was about data center switches, which also did see a decline. This is in the campus. And I think for similar reasons, for data center switches, we're seeing a slowdown in campus center switch revenue because of the pandemic and the backlogs, and then the surge of product coming out. Folks are digesting what they've already got. So I think this slip is probably temporary. I'm curious about last week. Also last week, Arista was an outlier in avoiding that revenue slip, and it's now taking more market share in campus switch sales. In this report, I would love to see the actual number on that, but the full report is gated. My assumption is Arista is starting from a very modest base in the campus, so any growth looks good there.
Yeah, you can get a lot of growth from a small base, is what you're saying.
I think that could be true, but they're also saying that one of the key things is it's AI. Again, a rising tide lifts all boats. But they've been plugging their training cluster, and they point to the fact that their Ethernet-based switches provided a 10% improvement in job completion against a rival technology from InfiniBand, which is, of course, owned by NVIDIA. And their basic take is, hey, we're better than they are, and we are a lot more focused on this market, and stay tuned. And that's actually not a bad place to be, because I think it's a bit wider than this. I think demand for campus networking is shrinking, first of all, substantially across the board. First of all, the post-COVID spending has declined substantially because a lot of people upgraded campus networks during the COVID period, but there was a shortage of inventory, so that's coming down. That's probably a significant contributor here. I'd also point out that distributed work or hybrid work or remote work, whatever you want to call it, has led to less office space and also delayed upgrades. If you've been looking at a campus upgrade and then you're looking at all the people who are not in your office anymore for some percentage of the companies out there, so a lot of the companies who have just white collar workers, like Dell, for example, struggling to get people back in the office. If you were budgeting for a campus network, maybe you aren't now, right? That's one thing. I'm also looking at branch reductions. We've seen a sequence of announcements over the past 5 years as companies wind back, like banks are winding back their branches, stores are winding back their number of stores that they have, and so forth. So I think there's a certain move away at the edge of the network. But probably most importantly, I think we're starting to see companies realize that SaaS and SSE replaces the need for a premium campus network, right? So this idea that you have one type of networking for out of the office and you have another type of network connection when you're in the office. So at home, you run up your SSE client and connect off to the intermediate. But when you suddenly get into the office, it's just like, oh no, you don't need to do that. That's confusing. And I think once you've got SSE and once you're running zero trust, you don't want to suddenly turn it off just because you're in a particular location. It doesn't make sense. But the main thing that I also think happening here is that Cisco made an all-out sales effort to sell its software-defined campus, that is the software-defined access, and it had a lot of initial success. It's a very complex solution. It involves overlays in the campus. A lot of customers signed up to it. Cisco made a massive push, and none of the other vendors had glommed on that there was a demand into campus networking. It caught Juniper and HP Aruba flat-footed, and now all of a sudden you've got this really interesting situation where Arista's going, we're going to be good enough. We're going to be easy to deal with than Cisco and slightly cheaper than Cisco. And that's exactly how I think they're winning here. Companies don't necessarily want the software-defined access model that Cisco's trying to uplift people to. Like the SDA, I believe, takes the price of your campus and lifts it by 300%, but it adds all of this software-defined security and overlay networks and stuff. And I think Arista's saying, sure, if you want that, because they got all that with Big Switch, by the way, when they acquired Big Switch a few years ago. But I think what Arista's saying is, well, if you just want a flat
Ethernet network, we're here for you. We don't want to upsell you to that if you don't want to buy it. And I think they can very quickly, win the sales process over Cisco and take market share away. And I suspect that's what we're seeing here as well. So it's not just one thing, it's multiple things.
Well, and I think you also highlighted the fact that Arista is taking customers away by being good enough, easier to deal with, and slightly cheaper than Cisco, which just brings to mind the Saturday Night Live character Stuart Smiley. I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and doggone it, people like me. So that may be Arista's strategy here.
Yeah, I guess I still feel like, we're talking about numbers where Cisco has something approximately like 60% of the campus Ethernet market, and Arista's got, I'm going to say, under 5%. I'm pulling the numbers out of the air, and if somebody can correct me with the follow-up, that's great. But so we're talking a huge difference. I also feel like
I think it's it's sure. I don't know that Arista will ever become the campus networking behemoth that Cisco was in its heyday. But the point is, there's still growth here if you're going to be good and deliver the right products. And obviously, Cisco's not doing it. So it is what it is.
That's true. Yeah. But I guess I question Arista's real wanting to fight for that campus business when most of their money's coming from, the big cloud providers, and that's who they're going to focus on.
Oh, the shareholders are pushing them, Drew. You read those analyst calls, and it's like, when are you going to get diversified revenue away from them? It's always the share of revenue that Arista gets, and in those shareholder thing, we're working hard to diversify our revenue income. They're just buying more and more of our stuff, though. It's like
right.
Yeah, we can't every quarter we can't help it if they're buying
showing up with the dump truck. What are we going to do?
That's right. Pretty much.
All right, moving on. The U.S. healthcare provider Geisinger is warning of the possible theft of data on more than 1 million patients. The data includes date of birth, address, phone number, and medical record number, among other information, including demographic information. Geisinger alleges that an employee of an IT provider called Nuance, which is a Microsoft subsidiary, stole records from Geisinger after the employee was fired. Apparently, Nuance forgot to revoke access credentials from that employee when he was fired. Geisinger says the former employee has been arrested and is facing federal charges.
I think it's notable here that Microsoft didn't apologize, and nor did it accept responsibility, even though they agree that their employee was at fault. Did you notice this? Microsoft acquired Nuance.
Boy, did I notice this.
Yeah. And Nuance was a company they acquired for many billions of dollars a while ago, and it specialized in transcription for health operators. The doctors talk into a thing, and it just transcribes and does the voice recognition and stuff. But to me, it's just another day for Microsoft customers. No big deal. No one seems to care. Microsoft's insecure. Microsoft's unsafe. Blah, 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 whatever. Who cares?
Yeah. And actually, I actually do, because a couple of weeks ago, Microsoft's president, Brad Smith, was actually testifying to Congress and repeatedly refused to take any ownership of any of the breaches that it had, even up to the point where somebody asked, well, hey, the Department of the Treasury had to inform you when it was breached because of your products. Do you see anything wrong with that? And basically, Brad Smith said something along the lines of, I would hope it wouldn't happen that way, which is like the most weaselly words. Yes, but it gets even worse, because at another point, somebody asked him about the abusive bundling practices. And he said, well, I don't know that we're doing any of those, when in fact it is an actual fact. And believe me, I know this is a fact, because I've negotiated with our clients with Microsoft in Enterprise 3 licenses. They had a number of APIs and integrations with third-party cybersecurity vendors that they disabled to force their customers to migrate to E5. So in other words, they had a cybersecurity capability that you could use. They turned it off and said, if you want more, you have to give us more money. You want it back, you have to give us more money. That's mob tactics.
There are signs that the governments are getting a bit frustrated with Microsoft and its weaselly ways. Microsoft especially wants to avoid litigation here, so I doubt it will ever admit that it was its fault unless forced to in a court, right? And even then, it will probably end up with some sort of settlement so that they don't actually accept responsibility, but they pay their way out of it. This week, the EU started an investigation into Microsoft Teams bundling, calling it abusive tying practices, which is definitely, if you read the note, it's definitely a frustration with Microsoft. It seems to be rather systemic, shall we say. It's not just a competitive thing. It's a frustration with Microsoft as a company, I felt.
Yeah, and honestly, I'll go out on a limb and say this here on the podcast, because I've already told my clients this multiple times. If you have not started thinking about your exit strategy from Microsoft, now is an excellent time. If the reaction causes you to go completely cold and start sweating, that's exactly the problem, because essentially they've got a business model of extortion, and you are the victim of it. So, I don't know what else to say.
It's compelling. It's compelling.
Yes. I'm not being, we're not being over the top here. When you've got the EU and the US governments rethinking their commitment to Microsoft, you can maybe point to that and say to your boss, hey, now is an excellent time to start thinking about getting away from this.
Or at the very least, start getting a better deal.
Well,
use that as leverage to negotiate a better deal.
I'm sorry, a better deal on tainted food. Oh, hi, this has rat poisoning, but you can get it for 20% off. Oh, awesome! I'll feed that to my baby. Sure.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of bean counters who might be like, that's a good deal, 20% off.
No?
I mean, and frankly,
My dad always used to say, he said, if you're going to have a poop sandwich, it's nice if there's lots of bread and some butter on it.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Well, anyway.
The other question is, and we can maybe debate this at another time, where are you going to go? So, all right, a quick break to tell you about our sponsor. That is Palo Alto Networks. You can discover the latest advancements in network security at Intersect 2024. This is a virtual event where industry tech and cybersecurity professionals discuss how advancements in SASE are reshaping expectations. Topics include the next chapter of SASE, securing workspaces on managed and unmanaged devices with a SASE native enterprise browser, mastering data security with AI, using SASE to accelerate application performance, and more. Intersect 2024 is available on demand now at intersect.paloaltonetworks.com. That's intersect.paloaltonetworks.com to see the event on demand at your leisure. And we thank Palo Alto Networks for being a sponsor.
All right. Comcores has launched Ethernet Core IP with heightened security. Digital core maker Comcores has just released a new Ethernet digital IP core that supplements existing MACsec capabilities around authentication, integrity, confidentiality, and a bunch of other things. Why do we care about this? Because having built-in security at the chip level is actually important and something to pay attention to, because that's really where you need to have it if you're looking for security and true end-to-end security.
Yeah, so this is where chip makers go and buy a package of intellectual property. When you talk about core IP, you're talking about intellectual property. Companies like Broadcom go and buy this piece of the chip design and then weld it inside of their own ASIC.
Exactly. That means it's coming out of the chips, and that's actually an important thing for enterprise IT folks to be paying attention to see what you're getting and to see what security is actually built into the chips downstream. So, one of the challenges is that most enterprise IT folks don't really care about what's going on inside the chips. And in my view, that's a little bit of a mistake, because having something that's built from the foundation to be secure is actually a benefit and a net positive. So my recommendation here is just to keep an eye on what's going out here with Comcores going forward, and see if other vendors are starting to keep pace.
That market is fragmenting as different vendors develop intellectual property and then start bringing it to market. Ethernet is becoming more and more of a commodity. And instead of there just being, Marvell and Intel making, Broadcom making Ethernet stuff, there's becoming a much more diverse market for this. So it's a signal of an emerging market, in my view.
Yeah, I think it's going to be very interesting in the short to medium term. It's just an early indicator of what's going to be interesting coming down the pike.
So the note here says that it's supplementing existing MACsec capabilities. And when I hear vendors particularly getting down into intellectual property talk about supplementing, I think, are we talking non-standard here, or a little bit non-standard, embrace and extend? Do you have a sense there of what we're talking?
Nope. Well, actually, I do. They claim that they're doing everything in accordance with IEEE 802.1a EDK 2023, which means it is going to be standard. They're just bolting on the standard capability. Now, that said, I haven't tested anything, so I can't prove that it actually adheres to the standard. Back in the day, I did run test labs, so that's why we always preface everything here saying vendors say, vendors claims, according to the vendor, etc.
Yeah, just a flag to have raised on that.
And moving right along, the next thing that's up is we finally put a pin in 5G, and we're moving on to 6G. They finally said the most important thing is the 5G advanced specification is done, which is the 3G PPB, which controls the standards for cellular wireless, has just basically said, we are done. 5G advanced is over. We are now moving on to begin work on 6G. And in fact, we've been hearing about 6G for the last, probably 18 months or so.
A bit longer than that, but yeah.
Right. You can look at the link.
We've been making noises about 6G for 5 years now. Even before 5G was even rolling out, they were talking about 6G.
There's always going to be a next thing.
This sounds to me like 3GPP is the standards body that drives the Gs in mobile networking, 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G. And if you're a standards body, you have to say something to remind people that you're around and that you exist and that you have some sort of meaning. And every time, each major evolution is a major marketing exercise. So 3G was a marketing exercise, 4G was a major marketing exercise, and 5G was. But the secret is that the 3G PPP standards regularly emits additions, enhancements, upgrades, and whatever. They just don't choose to call them 5.1G, 5.2G, 5.3G. They just sort of release them. And then at some point they go, oh, wow, we released a whole bunch of standards. Like with 4G, they took a whole bunch of stuff that was ready for 5G, but nobody could agree when 5G was going to be 5G. So they just released them. And then that was 4.5G. Did anybody remember 4.5G? Do you remember that, Drew?
I really don't.
I don't either.
It was a big deal. It was a big deal. AT&T in America absolutely went crazy over it and spent money on marketing.
I do remember AT&T's big push on it. It was a huge deal. Yes, you're right.
But in the end of the day, my point is made. No one really noticed that, and the upgrades happened. It didn't change anything. All of the changes in 6G are purely about operational enhancements, like containers, virtual machines, software operations, power saving, agreed standards for, shutting down towers at night to save electricity and so on and so forth. And the answer here is that for enterprise IT, nobody should care. Nobody should give a rat's tail for the whole thing. It's just business as usual. These standard organizations will continue to put out standards because they are standards organizations, and that's what they do, not because anybody wants it or needs it.
I will say that I'm looking forward to having my YouTube viewing interrupted by commercials from AT&T, Verizon, et al. On how great 6G is going to be. That'll be fun. Yeah. Looking forward to that.
I don't know. I think their marketing budgets are a little down now. They've been shrinking for a couple of years, but neither here nor there. Moving on to carriers and what they're up to. Comcast Business says that they are signing a deal with Starlink to add managed low Earth orbit options to its managed network services. So they're thinking about in the case where we actually can't get cable to you, we can get you Starlink if you need that for both, largely for backup, but also for temporary sites. That supplements their existing 4G and 5G based connectivity and have boxes that will allow you to fail seamlessly over to 4G and 5G and reaches places that 4G and 5G don't reach. Greg, I think you have some opinions about managed services. I would just say that if you are using managed services, this is actually a welcome addition for the really remotest of the remote locations, because once you get out in the boonies, it doesn't matter whether it's 4G, 5G, or 2G, you're not getting it. So this is a way to get connected.
But you know what's going to happen, Johna, is Comcast Managed Services is going to be managing a customer's network. It's going to make a mistake somewhere, or it's going to be in a location where it can't provide bandwidth directly or easily, or it may just not want to do business with the telco that's in that region. Whatever the reason is, it's business reason, not a technology reason. And they'll say, we'll just give them a Starlink. And then they'll suddenly put Starlink in the middle of a major town where there's not enough bandwidth and the zone is overloaded and it doesn't work. I mean, it's 2024 and people are still buying managed services from telco despite mountains of evidence and decades of experience that it always ends badly, right? Adding Starlink is basically a nothing kebab for customers. Starlink is desperate for money and will partner with nearly any large company. They don't want to do business with small companies because that's expensive. But any large company who says, yeah, you want to put Starlink's going to mob them. This is not a win for Comcast. And if I was a customer and Comcast came out and said, I'm going to give you Starlink, I'd be really questioning whether that's worth doing or whether I should be putting in my own SD-WAN and just using consumer-grade broadband and my own Starlink and doing it from there, because I know what's going to happen here. Comcast is going to treat it like a solution for all problems, and you're going to sell lots and lots of Starlink instead of running cables or taking 6 months to, bring a tail circuit in, or to even run an SD-WAN product that, would take too hard. Just put Starlink and connect it to our private network and boom. And customers are going to be complaining about how miserable Comcast is. I don't think you're actually
understanding how they're putting it together, because they usually add their wireless in as an SD-WAN. I'm staring to my Comcast SD-WAN as we speak. I do not think they're going to do what you're saying, because it's going to be more expensive to run traffic over Starlink, and Comcast would eat the cost. So maybe we can agree to disagree on that. But yep. I guess your take would be, if you're an existing Comcast customer, it's a nothing burger. If you're not an existing customer, you don't have it's not a reason to become a customer. Fair enough. If you are,
just watch out for Comcast giving you Starlink when it's not relevant. But then, of course, the sort of customer who's buying from Comcast managed services isn't going to know whether it's relevant or not.
They're protected by their own ignorance. I guess I feel like, for any service provider or telco partnering with Starlink makes sense to offer access to services to locations where they don't have a cable in the ground or a tower. So I have no problem with this announcement. I expect we'll see other tie-ups with other service providers. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a valid reason to put it into a managed SD-WAN service, and there is a valid reason to use a managed SD-WAN service. But I think the other thing to keep an eye on is this is a headline. This is a paper agreement.
Yes.
It'll get
Exactly.
interesting when it actually rolls out. For now, we can all have opinions, right? They're like belly buttons.
Everyone's got one.
And our last space networking story for the day, Amazon's Project Kuiper satellite broadband service won't come online until 2025. The project had hoped to start trialing satellite broadband this year, but satellites aren't expected to get into orbit until the last quarter of calendar year 2024. So testing will have to wait until next year.
So Kuiper, Project Kuiper, of course, Jeff Bezos' billionaire space toy. He wants a satellite network just like Elon and kicked it off a few years ago. Obviously, the original purpose was to justify the reasoning for Blue Origin to exist, his rocket company, which is also going quite badly. Kuiper had originally announced, like Starlink, that they were going to, start in, 1925 at some point, and then it became, I'm joking, right? Originally it was going to be 2022, then it was 23, 24, now it's 2025, whatever. Recently they were forced to book launches on anybody that they could get a booking on, because if they're going to get their satellites up, they needed to have launch vehicles, because Blue Origin is struggling to get their program up and running like SpaceX is, with this constant launching process that they're doing. And then a few months ago, they were forced to book slots onto Falcon 9 flights. So obviously the last person that, they wanted to give their money to was to their competitor, but they had to. But it's not looking good for Kuiper, because Starlink continues to upgrade and expand its fleet. The longer that Kuiper waits to get its satellites right, the more Starlink is producing the next generation. So Starlink is now shipping Starlink 2-point-something version of their satellites up into orbit. They're starting to build the second tier of the mesh network that they've talked about. And if at some point Kuiper just becomes too far behind, that we're getting into orbit isn't going to work, I'm still reasonably positive about OneWeb in Europe. I think that will ultimately continue longer and is the most likely competitor to Starlink eventually, but that's because it's supported by the European governments, right? So they are patient money. They can afford to invest for a long time, and they can afford to invest at a loss, placing it in the national interest. They may be a European thing where they say we need to have our own satellite network that is not related to the US government, and they may continue as OneWeb until the point where it's actually, and it might be 5 years away, but I think ultimately that patient money might win out over Kuiper, but will be interesting to see how that evolves over time.
In the battle between patient money and ego billionaire money, I'm going to put my bet down on the ego billionaire money. And frankly, I'm also glad to see competition in the space broadband network. I don't know that, that the market of underserved regions is great enough to justify all of this investment, but I'm hoping someday they can build these services out well enough to be competition for the telcos and service providers in well-served areas as well, because we do need more competition there. So get those satellites up into space, you rich guys.
There has to be a competitor. I just don't know. I don't think there's room for more than two. There'll be SpaceX and someone, and the question is who. I don't think there's room for 3 or 4 or 5 competitors in this space. Of course, the geosynchronous satellites will still be up. They'll still be there, but if they stay in business for long enough, yeah.
All right. Well, we've come to that moment. As we mentioned earlier, this is Greg's final network break show. And Greg, you've gotten a lot of farewells on LinkedIn and Slack and social media, but I wanted to selfishly take this opportunity to offer you my final personal FU. So first things, we've done almost 500 of these shows, and I'm really going to miss hanging out with you on Friday mornings to record. Sometimes after I'm done with the recording and I come out of the office, my wife will say, you were laughing a lot in there. Are you actually working? And yes, we were working, but we also had some fun while doing it, and hopefully listeners have had some fun too. Second, I know you've had some terrible experiences with bosses and managers in your career, but instead of perpetuating that trauma on your own employees, I couldn't have asked for a better boss. You are considerate, honest, and thoughtful. You created a workspace where Robin and I could grow and succeed, and you've always treated us like partners in this venture, not employees. So thank you for that. Last but not least, I've learned a lot from you about technology, about business, about how this industry works. And frankly, it's really easy to get cynical about it all. But I think the most important lesson I've learned from you is that behind all of the technology and the hardware and the silicon and the business, it's people. It's people who are doing a hard job in difficult circumstances, people who are curious, people who want to do their best, people who want to learn and grow. And that's who I think about when I do this job. It's a technology podcast, but you put people at the heart of it. That's what I love about this thing that you and Ethan built. So thank you for letting me be a part of it. I just want to say bon voyage on your well-earned retirement.
Thank you. Human infrastructure. I don't know when I came up with that, but that's always been the goal of this particular show, has always been to talk to the people about not the levers and the gears and the substructure that sits underneath our industry, and try and expose it a little bit, because I got to see it through being an influencer. I remember I started being an influencer in the late 2000s, around 2008 with Ethan, when we were blogging, and we were the first influencers. So if somebody said to me, "Oh, you're the OG influencer, right? The original sort of thing." And in 2008, they would fly us off to somewhere, and business class flights and all that sort of stuff. So that stuff you see with TikTok and YouTube was actually where we were, and I got to see inside and see underneath and talk to people about what's happening. And I thought that was what this show was trying to say to people. The product managers, the companies are trying to come together with strategies, and they're made up of hundreds of people. And what I've been trying to do is expose some of that understanding, so that you can understand what's happening. Just because I was lucky enough to see it doesn't mean there wasn't a reason for me to try and share that to you and help you think about the process. So thanks, Drew. And it's been working with you. It's been pretty awesome. Every Friday we've been doing this show in a crazy sort of a way. And you've really been covering for me for the last couple of years. I know I haven't been pulling my weight, and it's been great to have you around. And I want to say a big thanks to Ethan for putting up with me for the last 15 years. It's been pretty amazing. Thanks a lot, man. And we will be, Packet Pushers will continue. I will be gone. I won't be on social media. You won't be able to email me. You won't be able to contact me. I'll be off trying to get my health sorted out and find a way to get some peace. And I wish everybody all the best. And Johna, I hope everything goes well in the show, and that the audience is finding what they want from me with you and Drew going forward.
Well, thank you for the good wishes. And thank you also. I will add my voice to Ethan's and Drew's, that you've been really a shining light in this industry with your, no BS, tell it like it is, but always with no nastiness. And I think that's the thing that came through again and again in the follow-ups to anything we did together, was people would say, I love how you can disagree without being nasty, without being rude, without being obnoxious, because, we're all engineers. We look at the facts. Sometimes we come to different conclusions, but it's not about the personalities. It's about how to understand what's going on in the industry. So thank you for that. And best wishes and bon voyage.
Thank you.
I'm glad to know you'll be out there. Even if we don't get to hear them, you'll be thinking your thoughts. So thank you, Greg, for a great time with you over these years.
Thank you.
All right. That does wrap up this episode. We do have a sponsored Tech Bytes conversation with Palo Alto Networks on why SD-WAN is critical to a successful SASE strategy. It's coming right up. The rise of SASE has eclipsed SD-WAN as organizations develop strategies and analyze products for secure access, but SD-WAN is still an essential component of SASE. In fact, sponsor Palo Alto Networks says SD-WAN is the most important component. So on today's Tech Bytes podcast, we talk with Palo Alto Networks about why SD-WAN underpins a SASE offering, and we're going to discuss SD-WAN capabilities you should keep in mind when evaluating a secure access services edge solution. My guest is Rajesh Kari, Senior Product Marketing Manager at Palo Alto Networks. Rajesh, welcome back to the podcast. And I guess you've been hearing some industry murmurings that SD-WAN isn't as relevant anymore. What are you hearing, and what's your take?
That is true. With SASE, the evolution of SASE, we are hearing industries, some of our customers, how relevant is SD-WAN for my digital transformation? And that's exactly what I want to address in this podcast. For that, we need to face some of the realities. We are historically been very brand-centric. Pandemic changed it, but now we are back to normal. And that is evident in the stats. We, as Palo Alto Networks, are seeing a significant 50% or more growth in the branch traffic.
Okay.
What does it represent? More people are coming into the branches, and branches are becoming the core of all connectivity and access points for an organization, regardless of the industries, regardless of the use cases and the geos. The point here is, yes, branch is back in the conversation. It's imminent that the transformation of the branch should be the starting point for all digital transformation purposes, right? That'll be the first stepping stone towards a SASE strategy. That is the first thing to change or evolve to make your connectivity better and ensure that the user experience is available for all these applications, even the dynamic applications like SaaS and internet apps.
Okay, so that's interesting. You're saying you're seeing branch traffic growing, and SD-WAN is, very much focused on that branch transformation. So I guess, can you kind of talk about why then SD-WAN is so critical as a part of a broader SASE platform?
As part of the branch, let's see what the use cases for any end user has evolved to be. They're using the SaaS and the internet and the cloud applications more and more, which means that for a given organization, they should have the flexibility to connect to these applications in a very secure fashion. That's where SASE comes into play, right? Uh-huh. You make the connection possible with SD-WAN, and now you provide that secure connectivity to all these applications, regardless of where these applications reside or it's hosted. What we do at Palo Alto Networks is we connect your branches, ensure that these branches talk to the closest proximity, low latency security nodes, which is our Prisma Access nodes. Mm. And that becomes, the access points for all these SaaS and internet apps. So which means the branch connectivity not only gets that SD-WAN intelligence, the traffic steering, the prioritizations, and also the kind of the failover situations, but now you're also ensured a low latency connection all the way till the app. And that's why when I mentioned that, SD-WAN becomes critical, and it's also a stepping stone towards your SASE strategy, because you need SLA end-to-end, and that's exactly what SASE is aimed to provide.
Are you finding that SD-WAN is typically the way customers get into a SASE architecture?
It depends on their use cases, right? But as I mentioned, with the branches becoming more prominent, customers are seeing more problems arising at their branches. Uh-huh. More users coming in on a daily basis, using more SaaS and internet applications, which are also becoming dynamic on a daily basis. There is an increased demand for bandwidth, but at the same time, these users are also keen on keeping that application experience. Why? On a daily basis, we are constantly on these productivity apps, whether it is real-time applications or some kind of a collaborative applications. So the requirements for the branches have changed. With branches coming back into a key critical part of the infrastructure, now more and more customers are adopting this strategy. They want this connectivity to be reliable. They want this connectivity to be foolproof for all applications. Then they want to secure it. So yes, as the branches become more prominent, we see SD-WAN being the first step of that strategization for any organization.
So to my mind, SASE, Secure Access Service Edge, is generally about putting security capabilities into the cloud, in part to simplify having to deploy and operate security appliances or security features at physical sites. But SD-WAN is all about bringing those physical sites into a network. So what does SD-WAN bring to the table in terms of security? And do I really need that if I've got my, like my firewalling, my secure web gateway, my CASB, and all of that up in the cloud?
Well, we are seeing more and more customers going towards a cloud approach. There are three main reasons. One, having this massive distributed security apparatus or architecture in the cloud makes a huge difference in terms of connectivity and also performance. Uh-huh. As I mentioned, a branch which is in North America or JPAC or EMEA makes more sense to connect to their own security nodes to access all the applications. That's where the performance really makes a difference, right? And at the same time, what we have to be aware or what the organizations need to ensure is all the security nodes should be equipped with similar advanced security capabilities. Just because I am in a different geo doesn't mean that my application access needs to be compromised because that security node does not have certain capabilities. So every single security node should be equipped with the same security capabilities, literally a replica of each other, becoming this massive backbone, which enables this high performance access. So then that's number two, right? And finally, the operation. Typically, we have seen NOC and the SOC team, they live in their own worlds, try to troubleshoot and resolve issues on a daily basis, just focus on these two areas. But in reality, that's not how things work. The connectivity has to go hand in hand with the securing these connectivities, also the application access. So when a problem arises, you cannot have two different entities trying to chase the same problem with different mindsets. They should be looking at a single console. They should be looking at the same set of configurations. They should be looking at the same data to analyze and resolve these issues. So that's exactly what SASE delivers with SD-WAN and net security integrated.
Okay, because I'm integrating my networking with the SD-WAN, with the security elements, with the SSE part, the cloud delivered security, and I can surface all the relevant information to whichever side of the IT department needs to see it, is what you're telling me.
That's correct. That's exactly what I'm trying to say. With a fragmented solution, let's take the use cases, right? When I talk to customers, they typically say, like, I have a single issue. By the time I narrow it down, I'm on 6 different support calls to 6 different vendors. And in order to say that this is the root cause, there's constantly like, have we verified this? Have we looked into this different set of data? How does this data go together with another set of data? Most of the time, these data exist somewhere in the cloud, somewhere in the data center, and they have different parameters which don't even correlate. So it's pretty much like one of my customers said, finding a needle in a haystack, right? But with that single console, which SASE provides, which our Prisma SASE provides to our customers, imagine single applications from a single user in a given branch having a user experience issue or application outage. All the IT admin has to do is drill down from our single console on a user basis. For a given user, they can exactly see what was the path that was taken for the application. And in every individual hop, like it's exiting out of its branch network, it's exiting out of the service provider, it is exiting out of the cloud, all the way to the application server. They can identify, we have already identified what is going wrong. There has been a bandwidth degradation. There has been a service outage. There has been an application outage. There has been a security incident identified by our cloud delivered security. So they can literally have all of them in a single screen, drill down and find out what is causing that issue. That's exactly what works for our customers. And when we talk to our customers, when we show them in live action using our product, they are like, this is exactly what we need. And Drew, recently we also did our AI launch where we talked about our Copilot. The Copilot is even more significant because, imagine how traditionally issues were addressed. Someone comes to the office at 8 o'clock, they identify an issue or they experience an issue, they raise a trouble ticket with the IT help desk. Now the help desk starts reacting. The help desk doesn't usually react, they just document and send it to an expert. But what if the help desk themselves are able to go and query like what is happening across this particular branch site? Why is this particular application being degraded? And he has a response right there. That's exactly what Copilot provides, right? The first level of support themselves can narrow down what the issue is and get a quick response to the employee or the customer or any user in the organization. More importantly, imagine someone like a CXO, CIO, or a CISO. They want to go and see how is my infrastructure performing. We can provide them using the Copilot, using a single console. We can give the entire visibility. A CIO can say, my branch sites at America are doing great for a certain application. My JPAC are poorly performing because of a service provider issue. My EMEA is doing great, but is lacking certain bandwidth limitations, which I need to plan for. So from a CXO, think about it. You are actively creating the plan to address these issues. So if there is a budget requirements in EMEA for more bandwidth, yep, that gets done. If there is a better service provider connectivity needed for your JPAC sites, that is taken care of. So it's not just reacting and creating a plan based on the issues that you're facing, but rather proactively taking investment decisions that will enable a very smooth process for all organizations.
So you're saying with this Copilot feature, an executive who may not be, into the console all that much can sort of show up and use a natural language query to get some information on general performance and see, in EMEA, it looks like bandwidth is an issue. So maybe the next time, we're having a budget meeting, I need to start thinking about allocating for more bandwidth for this region.
Absolutely. That's exactly what the intent of Copilot is. And that you made a great point, that natural language, right? Which means not everyone has to be an expert. Not everyone has to have that deep dive knowledge into how the enterprise is being connected. For them, all they want to know is, I know there is a branch site in EMEA, and I want to see the performance. I know there is a widespread security breach or an incident. I want to see if my enterprise is being secured. Is we already being addressed, and these threats are blocked across my organizations. There's been no impact or outage because of it. So this is the power of that natural language, which anyone can use with minimal expertise and without even having a sound knowledge of the entire enterprise.
Yeah, definitely useful for help desk in that executive example. I want to wrap up on this question. So I think when people are thinking about SASE, they may spend a lot of time evaluating that cloud security portion of it because it's so important, but we also want to emphasize SD-WAN is still important. So when they're thinking about that SD-WAN component, what are some things they should keep in mind when they're looking at SASE solutions on the SD-WAN side?
Great question. So the first thing that anyone should be aware of is how easy it is to onboard your SASE, right? It brings back to the importance of SD-WAN. With our Prisma SD-WAN, it's a seamless process to onboard your security services, which also means that your branch sites are quickly deployed. And since we use single policy for both networking and security, your provisioning is also happening rapidly. So instead of bringing, say, if it's a brand new branch or an existing branch, or you're in the process of doing an acquisition and mergers, it's a matter of minutes for our customers. And because this single configuration or a single policy is being used across the network and security constructs, it's easy to get the visibility. It's easy to do change management, and it's also extremely simple to get granular insights into how these applications and user access are being done. So overall, if you see the easy onboarding process, the rapid provisioning process, and finally that quick resolution process is what makes SD-WAN a great starting point for a SASE strategy.
Okay, one more bonus question before we wrap. There are different approaches to SASE. You can do a mix and match. You can get your SD-WAN and your SSE from different folks. Obviously, Palo Alto Networks supports both approaches, but Rajesh, you also feel like you can make a case for the single vendor approach.
So let's think about the single vendor approach, right? If you're using a dual vendor or a multi-vendor approach, there's always going to be separate data sets, separate consoles, separate set of challenges to go through. With a single vendor, with our vision of delivering the platformization, it's an easy procurement process. You're dealing with just a single vendor for all your support cases, upgrades, maintenance. But most importantly, as a solution, you're looking at one data set, whether it is for networking, security, user experience. So that one single data set is what allows leveraging AI ML for all kinds of purposes, whether it is insights, visibility, automated remediation, and also enabling a lot of automation techniques to be incorporated or Gen AI techniques to be incorporated to simplify infrastructure leaders' life. So that is very, very key for any organizations who's looking for transforming with the power of AI. And that's exactly what we said during our AI launch. So please do take a look. We've done a fantastic video with Keanu Reeves. It's a game changer for any of our customers.
All right. Well, thank you, Rajesh. That does bring us to the end of the episode. If you want to get more details about SASE and SD-WAN from Palo Alto Networks, you can go to paloaltonetworks.com/SASE/SD-WAN. We'll have that link and others in the show notes that accompany this episode. Thanks, Rajesh, for joining us. And thanks to Palo Alto Networks for being a longtime sponsor of Packet Pushers. Sponsors make it possible for us to bring you free technical podcasts, blogs, videos, and more, all for your professional development. Speaking of which, you can find this and many more fine free technical podcasts and our community blog. It's all at packetpushers.net. You can hear us on Spotify, leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts, connect with us on LinkedIn. And last but not least, remember that too much networking would never be enough.